So, for our final piece of reflecting on the Church of England and colonial Virginia, I've titled this section Stamped from the Beginning: Genocide and Enslavement in African Virginia. I borrowed that phrase, stamped from the beginning, from the work of Ibram X. Kendi in his book. And we could think about how Anglican colonists encounter both Native Americans, Indigenous people, and African people, and what that means for the development and the quality of the Episcopal Church and how it encounters others and difference. Just a little background on Indigenous people in North America. Estimates range that before 1492, there were somewhere between 2.1 million and 18 million Native Americans in the Northern Hemisphere. The estimate is huge. My own inclination is to peg it at that higher number. In the United States in 1892, so 400 years later, there are only 250,000 known Native Americans living in the United States. There's a scale of genocide that has happened there. And the story in the United States starts with the story in Virginia. One of the things to keep in mind is that, to a large degree, the British colonial policy in North America was all about outmaneuvering both Spain and France. These are two Roman Catholic countries with imperial aspirations. England is a Protestant country with imperial aspirations. England wants to form a wedge between Spain to the south in the Americas and France to the north. All three would-be empires understand mission to indigenous peoples as part of the process of creating empire in those regions, or extending a godly reign over them. A reign that fuses church and monarchy in different ways. So initially, when the colonists in Jamestown and that region encounter the local Powhatan people, their first impulse is towards conversion. I have a text I assigned to you. It has a lengthy title of a prayer duly said morning and evening upon the court of guard, either by the captain of the watch himself or by some of his principal officers. This is a PDF that I've attached for you. It's a very long prayer, as you've encountered. I want to highlight the portion of prayer on the bottom of page 66. And now, O Lord of mercy, O Father of the spirits of all flesh, look in mercy upon the Gentiles who yet know thee not. The Gentiles here are the indigenous people of the Americas, and specifically the Powhatan. O gracious God, be merciful to us and bless us, and not us alone, but let thy ways be known upon earth, and thy saving health amongst all nations. Skipping down a sentence. And seeing thou hast honored us to choose us out to bear thy name unto the Gentiles, we therefore beseech thee to bless us, and this our plantation which we and our nation have begun in thy fear and end for thy glory. The prayer goes on, invoking God, beseeching God that the colonists engage in right moral behavior so that these Gentiles, the indigenous people, might see their example and be converted. So there's this initial idea of conversion, that somehow the mere presence of Christians and their moral behavior will bring others to them, not considering that there might be an already existing moral code. Not surprisingly, Powhatans resist these efforts at conversion. This leads to the kidnapping of children to be catechized and converted. The idea is it's better to take children from their rightful parents than risk their enduring in what Anglicans considered idolatry. Following that is violence and conquest against the Powhatan people, and this is justified because they're deemed as so-called heathens, that is, they're not Christian. They have a darker skin tone that leads the English to consider them of a different human quality. This in turn leads to their conquest and slavery. So, for example, an Anglican chaplain, the Reverend Robert Gray, declares it is a divine right to cast out the Canaanites. The Canaanites now are these Gentiles, these Powhatan people. And the English are, metaphorically, the Israelites. This notion of violence giving way following conversion fails is especially dominant after there's an uprising by the Powhatan in 1622. We find in here a cluster of notions of genocide, of the beginning of racialized thinking, of a notion of Christian superiority over other peoples. These are all ideas that are bubbling up as European Christians are beginning to encounter others. This accelerates as we begin to encounter African slavery in the Virginia colony. Many of the indigenous people die in the context of slavery. And in their stead come Africans. In 1619, 101 years ago, the first enslaved Africans were imported to Jamestown. You might have read the 1619 Project material developed by the New York Times. If you can find that material, I highly encourage you to read that as a way to further your knowledge of this event. Ironically, 1619, the year in which the first enslaved Africans arrive in Jamestown, is also the same year in which the Church of England is officially established as the church by royal decree in that colony. What's interesting is that these enslaved Africans are not initially a target for conversion, unlike the Native Americans. Most Anglican clergy, with a few exceptions, do not speak out against slavery in the Virginia colony or elsewhere, because the colony depends economically on the planters and merchants who are using slave labor, the tobacco fields, other forms of agricultural production, other forms of tradecraft are being deployed by enslaved people. Enslaved people are denied sacraments and church membership by civil law. And this is so that these people may not be freed from their condition. This is what makes them different than European descended indentured servants at the same time. In fact, slave laws like this are developed because European descended indentured servants and Africans who were held in bondage were beginning to make common cause seeking their equally just treatment. So the development of racialized laws and racialized slavery emerges in the middle of the 17th century. Specifically, in 1667, the Virginia General Assembly passes a law that states baptism does not result in freedom from slavery. This completely upends a millennia, well over a millennia, of church teaching that held Christians could not enslave other Christians. Now, This indicates that slavery was common in Christian Europe, as it was common in Jewish contexts, as it was common in Islamic contexts. Slavery is a givenness, unfortunately, of parts of human history. Monotheistic traditions have ruled that one could not enslave someone of the same religion. This is found in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. The Virginia General Assembly says no. Even if a enslaved person of African descent becomes a Christian, or is discovered to be a Christian because that person was actually a Christian in Africa, which could have been the case by this point in time due to European activity along the western coast of Africa, that person nonetheless was still a slave. And this was for economic reasons. In a similar way, children born of a black woman and a white father, as the law decrees, would remain slaves. This, too, is the opposite of English common law that held that a child of a free man could be free. So there's this complete inversion of both Christian and common law centered in an economic focus for the wealth of the planter class in colonial Virginia. This decree is really heartbreaking in the context of enslaved people. And we have a document I've shared with you. It's a URL link. I want to read the whole of it for you as you also find it. This is a letter sent by a group of enslaved Christian of African descent to the Bishop of London, Bishop Gibson, in 1723. To the Right Reverend Father and God, my Lord Archbishop of London, this comes to satisfy your honor that there is in this land of Virginia a sort of people that is called mulattoes, mixed ancestry people, which are baptized and brought up in the way of the Christian faith, and follows the ways and rules of the Church of England, and some of them has white fathers and some white mothers, and there is in this land a law or act which keeps and makes them their seed slaves forever. So this is a letter to the Bishop of London from a group of enslaved Anglicans of a mixed African and European English ancestry. We, your humble and poor partitioners, do beg, sir, your aid and assistance in this one thing, which is that your honor will, by the help of our sovereign, Lord King George, and the rest of the rulers, will release us out of this cruel bondage. And here it is to be noted that one brother is a slave to another, and one sister to another, which is quite out of the way. And as for me, myself, I am my brother's slave, but my name is secret. So here, the curtain is pulled back, and the sinfulness, the horror of this social reality is laid bare to the bishop. A brother is enslaved. A sister is enslaved. And it's likely our ancestry has come out of forcible rape and sexual assault of enslaved African-descended women. We are commanded to keep holy the Sabbath day, and we do hardly know when it comes for our taskmasters, and they are as hard with us as the Egyptians was with the children of Israel. We are kept out of the church, and matrimony is denied us. And to be plain, they do look no more upon us than as if we were dogs, which I hope, when these strange lines come to your lordship's hands, will be looked into. So, again, we have Christians who are petitioning that the basic rights be afforded to them, that they be allowed to attend church, that they be allowed to be married, to enter into Christian estates. And sir, we, your humble petitioners, do humbly beg that our children may be brought up in the way of the Christian faith, and our desire is that they may be learned the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and the Ten Commandments, and that they may appear every Lord's Day at church before the curate to be examined, for our desire is that godliness should abound amongst us. We desire that our children be put to school and learn to read through the Bible. It's interesting what their principal hope is, that their children be fully catechized, that they be brought into the fullness of the life of the church. And I think this petition is so that perhaps if their children are recognized as fully Christian, maybe then their children will be liberated. For in God's order, how can one Christian enslave another? I think that's the rhetorical undercurrent of this section of the letter. The author continues, "My writing is very bad. I am but a poor slave that write it, and has no other time but Sunday, and hardly that at sometimes. We dare not subscribe any man's name to this for fear of our masters. For if they knew that we have sent home to your honor, we should go near to swing upon the gallows tree." The letter ends with the writer saying, we can't sign our names. We can't let you know who we are, because if we do, our Christian masters will lynch us. Once we realize the full depth of what's being said in this letter, it's horrifying. It's sobering. It fills me with sadness. It's sin laid bare. What's unfortunate is this letter was only discovered about a decade ago. It appears Bishop Gibson received this letter and did nothing about it. Slavery in Anglican Virginia was approved of, implicitly or explicitly, by the Church of England. We see this unfold even further when we think about the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. This is a missionary group that we'll talk about more next week, that in part is committed to ministry to enslaved people. But it also engages in what I cynically call here in the lecture notes the Anglican genius of compromise. That is, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel is interested in catechizing slaves, spreading the gospel to them. But they also represent the interests of the planter class by supporting in 1667 the legislation that kept enslaved Christians as slaves. They also seek to represent the enslaved people's interests by insisting that these people were indeed equal to white European descent people as simply human beings, and capable of education, being morally uplifted, capable of attaining salvation. So there is a double-sidedness here and a paternalism here in what the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel is up to. It says, yes, these people are fully human. Christ died too for their sins. These people can advance morally, but they'll always be slaves under Christians. This leads to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel then giving sanction and respectability to the practice of slavery. They ease the conscience of the Anglican white English slave owner. We see here then racist structures underlining all that happens with enslavement in colonial Virginia. Many slaves are not initially converted. This is due to a number of reasons. One is that The average colonist is not very interested in any mission activity to them for this very problem of whether or not a Christian could enslave another Christian. There was a belief that catechizing enslaved people properly took away from their economic productivity. We saw this in the letter where the author says, "I barely have time to write this letter to you. Even on Sundays, I have to work." The enslaved person does not have their full humanity in this system. They are a unit of economic production. And there is a racist assumption by Europeans that enslaved people are not as capable of receiving the fullness of religious instruction, that somehow they're deemed as mentally inferior. And thus, implicitly, maybe they really can't fully become Christian. This is a deeply racist assumption, and one that's patently and fundamentally untrue. And yet we see this racist structure being built into the Church of England in Virginia, where Anglicans themselves are being separated into two racialized categories and not being able to fully be the body of Christ because of purely economic interests. That is, economic interests drive the creation of racialized categories, racialized hierarchies that then begin to racialize theology and religious reasoning itself by the enslavers. One of the things we'll want to watch out for is how do the enslaved offer counter-religious theological narratives. So we're left with some serious implications. One, that colonial Anglicanism was practiced within racist and racialized parameters. And two, that slavery and the creation of these racialized patterns, structures, and hierarchies occurs in part because Anglican authorities at the highest levels, lay and ecclesiastical, both permit it to happen and wish for it to happen.